I'm 47 years old. For the last 3 years, I've carried 19 words in my head that I'm not supposed to remember. Words isn't the right term. Phonetic sequences, structured vocalizations, something that resembled language but came from 30 meters underwater, where nothing capable of language should exist. My name is Dr. Adrian Hale. I hold a doctorate in marine bioacoustics from Scripps Institution of Oceanography. For 11 years, I conducted legitimate deep-sea acoustic research in the Channel Islands Marine Sanctuary. I've published 23 peer-reviewed papers. I've identified 3 previously unknown cetacean vocalization patterns. My work was funded by NOAA, the Navy's Oceanographic Research Division, and 2 private marine conservation foundations. On the night of August 17, 2021, during a routine solo dive to record nocturnal biological sounds, I captured something on my hydrophone that made me surface immediately, hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the ladder to my research vessel. I listened to the playback 7 times in the darkness of my cabin. I began transcribing what I heard. I understood that I was holding evidence of something that would be taken from me. 41 hours later, 2 men arrived at my research station with federal credentials and legal authority I couldn't challenge. They confiscated my recording equipment, my backup drives, my dive logs, my field notes, and the laptop where I'd been working on transcription. They were methodical. They were polite. They made me sign documents I wasn't allowed to read fully. But in those 41 hours, I had committed those 19 sequences to memory. I've never published them. I've never returned to night diving. I've never worked in federal waters again. This is what I recorded. This is what they took. This is why I believe something intelligent lives in the ocean that we're not supposed to know about. I need to establish what I was doing there, so you understand this wasn't amateur speculation. This was professional data collection in a location where I had 11 years of baseline recordings. The Channel Islands Marine Sanctuary covers 1,470 square miles of protected waters off the California coast. I maintained a research station on the eastern edge of Santa Cruz Island from 2010 through 2021. My project focused on deep-sea bioacoustics, identifying, cataloging, and analyzing the sound signatures of marine life in zones between 50 and 300 meters depth. Night diving was standard procedure. Nocturnal species produce different vocalizations than daytime populations. Boat traffic drops to near zero after dark, eliminating most anthropogenic noise pollution. The acoustic environment at night represents the ocean's natural sound profile. What existed before human activity saturated the water with engine noise, sonar, and industrial frequency interference. I dove solo frequently. Not recklessly. I had 20 years of dive experience, full technical certifications, and redundant safety equipment. But acoustic research requires isolation. A dive partner means additional noise, breathing patterns, equipment adjustments, movement through water. For clean recordings, you need to minimize every variable you can control. August 17, 2021 was optimal for recording. New moon phase, minimal surface wind, no maritime traffic in the sanctuary zone. I'd selected a dive site I'd visited 40 times before, a shelf formation that dropped from 30 meters to 80 meters, known for diverse biological activity. I'd recorded there in every season. I knew what belonged in that soundscape. My equipment was professional grade. A Teledyne resin TC4032 hydrophone capable of capturing frequencies from 5 Hz to 125 kHz. A Sound Devices Mix Pre 6.2 recorder with 32-bit float recording, essentially impossible to distort or clip even with extreme dynamic range. I wore the hydrophone mounted on a custom rig that kept it isolated from my body noise, positioned 2 meters away on a retractable tether. I spliced my audio feed to my dive computer's headset. Standard practice. It let me monitor what I was recording in real time, adjust positioning if I picked up equipment noise, and identify interesting biological activity worth extending the dive to capture. I entered the water at 9:47 p.m. Water temperature was 14 degrees Celsius at the surface, expected to drop to 11 degrees Celsius at depth. Visibility was effectively zero, night diving in. Open ocean is diving in absolute darkness beyond your light cone. I descended slowly, equalizing pressure, letting my eyes adjust to the black. At 15 meters, I switched off my primary dive light, another standard procedure for acoustic work. Light attracts and alters behavior. I kept only a small marker strobe on my tank, blinking every 3 seconds, enough to orient myself, not enough to illuminate anything beyond half a meter. The descent to 30 meters took 8 minutes. I reached the shelf formation and stabilized my buoyancy. I could feel the rock face to my right, the open water to my left, dropping away into deeper darkness. I deployed the hydrophone to its full extension and began recording. For the first 23 minutes, I documented exactly what I expected. The clicks and whistles of deep foraging dolphins, probably rhesos based on frequency pattern, the low-frequency pulse of a distant ship, far enough that it registered as background texture rather than dominant noise, the crackle of snapping shrimp colonies on the rock face, the biological static of a healthy nocturnal ecosystem. I was relaxed. I was doing work I'd done hundreds of times. I was listening to the ocean I knew. Then I heard something else. The sound came through my headset at 10:34 p.m. I know the exact time because I checked my dive computer the moment I froze in the water. It wasn't loud. That's important. This wasn't a sudden explosion of noise that startled me. It was woven into the ambient sound, emerging gradually enough that for the first few seconds I processed it as biological, something known but unusual, a vocalization I'd need to identify later during analysis. Then my brain caught up to what my ears were hearing. The pattern was too structured. It had rhythm, it had repetition, with variation. It sounded like someone underwater was testing their voice, finding sounds that worked, building towards something. I stopped moving completely. In technical diving, you're trained to control your breathing, to minimize your oxygen consumption, to stay calm. I wasn't calm. My heart rate spiked. I could feel it pounding against my wetsuit. But I held position, hanging weightless at 30 meters, listening. The sound continued for 18 seconds, a sequence of tonal vocalizations, each lasting between 1 and 3 seconds, separated by brief silence. The frequencies were in a range I associated with dolphin communication, roughly 4 to 8 kilohertz, but the quality was wrong. Dolphins produce clicks, whistles, burst pulses. This was melodic. This had phrasing. It stopped abruptly. The ambient soundscape returned. Shrimp, distant ship, water movement. I waited motionless for 2 full minutes. Nothing repeated. I made the decision to surface, not panic. I didn't bolt. But I terminated the dive immediately, began controlled ascent, maintained my safety stop at 5 meters for the required 3 minutes despite wanting desperately to get to my equipment and replay what I'd just captured. I reached the surface at 10:51 p.m. The boat was anchored 30 meters from my ascent point. I swam to it in darkness, using the anchor light to navigate, pulled myself up the dive ladder, and sat on the deck in my wetsuit, dripping, reaching for the recorder with hands that were shaking. I rewound to the timestamp. I pressed play. It was there, clear, undistorted, exactly as I'd heard it underwater, but now isolated in my boat's cabin, with the hatch closed and my full attention focused on every detail. I listened to it 7 times in a row. I kept thinking I'd made a mistake, that repeated listening would resolve it into something ordinary. Dolphin mimicry, maybe. They're capable of imitating complex sounds, whale song fragment carried from deeper water, some acoustic phenomenon I'd simply never encountered. But it didn't resolve. It became stranger. The vocalizations had structure. They began lower in frequency and pitch, rising gradually. The third sound in the sequence echoed the first, but modified, like a variation on a theme. The pauses between sounds were inconsistent, but not random. They felt intentional, like someone gathering breath. The last vocalization was the one that stopped me completely. It rose in pitch, held for almost 3 seconds, then dropped into a pattern that sounded, and I'm choosing this word carefully because I mean it, interrogative. It ended on an upward inflection, like a question. I sat in my cabin until past midnight, listening to those 18 seconds on repeat. I made notes. I tried to map the frequency patterns. I began phonetic transcription, attempting to render sounds that didn't correspond to any language into something I could write down. At 1:30 a.m., I created 3 backup copies onto separate drives. I didn't consciously think I was worried about losing the recording, but some survival instinct made me redundant. I didn't sleep. I watched the sun rise over the Channel Islands, knowing I'd captured something that couldn't exist, and not knowing yet what that meant for me. The first thing he did, sitting in the darkness with the boat rocking under him, was run through the catalog in his head. Dolphins. He'd recorded thousands of hours of dolphin vocalizations, clicks, whistles, burst pulse sounds. They could mimic, certainly. There were documented cases of captive dolphins producing sounds that approximated human speech patterns. But this wasn't approximation. This had structure, intentional phrasing. He played it back a third time, headphones pressed tight against his ears. The sound came in intervals, 16 seconds of what could only be described as vocalization, silence. Then response, a different pattern, lower register, from a different position in the water. Call and answer. Whales, he thought, had to be. He'd spent 2 years off the coast of Alaska recording humpback songs. He knew their range, knew their complexity. But humpbacks weren't in these waters this time of year, and their songs operated on a completely different structural principle, long evolving sequences that changed gradually over seasons. This was segmented, discrete units that repeated with variation. He pulled up his reference library on the laptop, played comparison files. Bearded seals, no, wrong frequency range entirely. Leopard seals, closer. But leopard seals produced those sounds during breeding season, and the pattern was wrong, too conversational. Walrus vocalizations, not even close. He worked through every cataloged species in the regional database, 37 different marine mammals, none matched. The vocalization had qualities that didn't belong to any animal he'd studied. There was breath in it, articulation. The way the sound stopped and started suggested a vocal structure, something with control, with intention behind the production. He isolated the clearest segment, ran it through his analysis software. The spectrogram showed something that made him sit back. Formant structure, the acoustic signature of a vocal tract, throat, mouth, tongue position, the kind of thing you saw in human speech or in primates. Marine mammals didn't produce sounds this way. They used laryngeal sacs, nasal passages, specialized structures that left completely different acoustic fingerprints. This showed a vocal anatomy that shouldn't exist underwater. He checked his equipment, ran diagnostics on the hydrophone, the recorder, the signal chain, everything nominal, no electronic artifacts, no interference. The recording was clean. He played it again. There was melody to it. Not the way whales sang. That was pure, musical, almost mechanical in its precision. This had the irregularity of speech, emphasis on certain sounds, variation in pitch that felt like inflection, question and answer. 17 distinct phonetic units in the first sequence, 11 in the response. He'd spent 8 years studying marine bioacoustics, had published 14 papers, had recorded everything from ice crack acoustics in the Arctic to shrimp colonies in the tropics. He knew what belonged in the ocean. This didn't. The most disturbing part wasn't the sound itself, it was the timing. He'd been at 30 meters when he first heard it, had frozen mid-movement, floating in the darkness with his dive light cutting a narrow cone through the water. The vocalization had come from somewhere below him, maybe 50 meters down, maybe more. Sound traveled strangely in thermoclines, bent and distorted by temperature layers. He'd held completely still, listening. And then, response, from a different direction, shallower. Perhaps 20 meters to his northwest. They were talking to each other, not calling, not echolocating, not broadcasting breeding sounds or territorial warnings. The timing, the turn-taking structure, the way the second vocalization seemed to acknowledge and answer the first, that was conversation. He'd encountered intelligent communication underwater before. Orcas coordinating hunts, dolphins problem-solving in groups. But he'd always known what he was listening to, could place it in context, identify the species, understand the behavioral framework. This was intelligent communication from something unknown. He saved the analyzed audio under 3 different file names, copied it to 2 separate backup drives, encoded the date, time, and GPS coordinates in the metadata. Then he sat in the darkness and considered whether to tell anyone. The research station where he was based, a small facility on the coast, funded by NOAA grants and university partnerships, had protocols for unusual findings, report through proper channels, document thoroughly, submit for peer review. But he'd been in this field long enough to know what happened to certain discoveries. The bloop, recorded in 1997, massive ultra-low frequency sound, organic in character. NOAA eventually attributed it to ice calving, but he'd heard the original recordings, seen the analysis before the official explanation, the 52 Hz whale. Tracked for years, calling at a frequency no other whale used, never receiving a response. A lonely anomaly that raised questions no one wanted to answer about what else might be out there, isolated and unknown. The Julia Sound, the slowdown, the upsweep. Dozens of unexplained acoustic events in the ocean, each eventually given a mundane explanation or quietly archived. This was different. This suggested something present, active, and communicating in patterns that resembled language. He played the recording one more time. At second 43, there was a specific sequence. 5 distinct sounds, each about a half-second long, with clear breaks between them. They had the rhythm of words, the phonetic structure of syllables. If he'd heard this on land, in any human language he didn't speak, he would have recognized it as speech immediately. But it came from 30 meters underwater, in darkness, from something that had no right to speak at all. He took off his headphones. The cabin was silent except for the slap of water against the hull. Somewhere in the ocean around him, in the black water beneath the boat, they were still down there, still talking. He didn't sleep. By 0400 hours, he'd created 7 separate backup copies, 2 on external drives, 1 uploaded to an encrypted cloud storage account he'd set up years ago for field data, 1 copied to a micro SD card he sealed in a waterproof case, 3 more on different devices scattered through his equipment. Redundancy. If something happened to 1 copy, 6 others existed. He labeled none of them, obviously, embedded them in folders of routine data, calibration files, equipment tests, ambient noise recordings from other dates, made them invisible in the catalog unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. At dawn, he started the transcription work. His laptop open, audio waveform displayed across the screen, he began isolating each phonetic unit, played them individually, repeated them aloud, testing how his own vocal anatomy could approximate the sounds. Some were impossible, too much resonance. Produced in ways human vocal cords couldn't manage, others he could almost match. He settled on a phonetic transcription system using symbols that approximated what he heard. 17 sounds in the first sequence. He marked them a, li, ka, me, ra, no, su, lin, da. Not words, not exactly, but structured like words. Discrete units with emphasis patterns with what felt like semantic weight. The response sequence, 11 units, te, la, ri, a, ko, Mo Sa-hun. Lower register. Different voice. He was certain of that now, listening with fresh attention. The first sequence had a higher fundamental frequency. The second, responding sequence came from something with a larger resonance chamber, different speaker. He worked for 6 hours straight. By noon, he had 19 distinct phonetic units transcribed with confidence. The rest of the recording, nearly 4 minutes of audio, contained additional vocalizations, but they were more distant, partially obscured by water noise and his own breathing apparatus in the recording. These 19 were clear, undeniable. He saved the transcription document, encrypted it, backed it up separately. Then he made his first mistake. He called Dr. Sarah Chen, a colleague, from his graduate program. She specialized in cetacean communication at an institution in California. They'd published together twice. He trusted her. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. He explained what he'd recorded, described the acoustic structure, offered to send a clip. She was silent for a long time after he finished. "Don't send it," she finally said. "Why not?" "Just don't. Not yet. Let me think about who should hear this first." Something in her voice, hesitation or warning. "Sarah, this is significant. This could be—" "I know what it could be. That's why you need to be careful who you tell." They hung up with an agreement that he'd wait. Give her 24 hours to consult with someone she knew at NOAA, someone discreet. He felt uneasy after the call ended. The rest of that first day, he reviewed the audio obsessively, checked and rechecked his analysis, ran different filtering processes to eliminate any possibility of equipment artifact or signal contamination. Every test confirmed the same conclusion. The sounds were real, vocal, structured, intelligent. That night, alone in the research station's small dormitory, he lay awake, listening to the ocean through the open window. He'd spent 15 years working in marine environments, felt at home on the water, under the water. The ocean had always been a place of clarity for him, straightforward. Governed by physical laws, biological principles, measurable phenomena. Now it felt different. There was something out there he hadn't known about, something that could speak. And the fact that it existed, unrecorded in any scientific literature, suggested either a massive gap in human knowledge or something deliberately kept hidden. The second day. He spent the morning organizing his documentation, date-stamped everything. Created a detailed log of the dive, depth, duration, water temperature, visibility, equipment used, made it official, scientific, unassailable. At 14:30 hours, his phone rang. Unknown number. "Dr. Marcus Webb," he confirmed. "This is Agent Carver, Naval Intelligence. I understand you've made a recording that may pertain to classified maritime activity. I'll need to ask you some questions about the circumstances." His stomach dropped. "I'm sorry? Who did you say you were?" "Naval Intelligence. We've been informed you captured audio that may contain sensitive material. I'll be at your location this evening to discuss retrieval." "Retrieval?" "Of the recording and associated equipment. This is voluntary cooperation, Dr. Webb. But I should inform you that if the material intersects with national security protocols, there are legal mechanisms we can invoke." The call ended. He sat staring at his phone. Sarah hadn't contacted anyone discreet. She'd reported him. Or, worse possibility, someone had been listening, monitoring communications from the research station, flagged keywords in his conversation with her. He had maybe 5 hours. He worked fast, pulled the micro SD card from its waterproof case, buried it in a maintenance toolbox in the equipment shed, removed 2 of the backup drives, sealed them in plastic bags, and hid them in separate locations, one inside a container of dive weights, one behind the insulation panel in the shower facility. The cloud backup was already secure. They couldn't touch that. Without warrants, he doubted they'd bother pursuing. But the original recording, the laptop, the main drives, those were gone. He accepted that. What he needed to preserve was the transcription, the 19 phonetic units, the evidence that he'd heard it, analyzed it, documented it. He copied the transcription file onto a thumb drive, printed a hard copy, folded it into his wallet. Then he reformatted the laptop, made it look like routine maintenance, left just enough data that it wouldn't seem suspicious, recent dives, equipment logs, nothing unusual. At 19:20 hours, headlights came up the access road. 2 men, federal credentials, exactly as promised. One identified himself as Agent Carver. The other didn't introduce himself, just stood by while Carver did the talking. They were polite, professional, and absolutely thorough. They took the hydrophone recorder, the laptop, the main backup drive he'd intentionally left visible, his dive computer, even his field notebook, though he'd written nothing about the recording in it. "This is voluntary," Carver repeated. "Your cooperation is noted and appreciated." He signed a form, didn't read it carefully. Later, he'd realize it was a non-disclosure agreement with legal language about classified maritime data. The whole process took 43 minutes. When they left, the research station felt hollow, stripped. He walked out to the dock and sat in the darkness. They hadn't asked about backups, hadn't searched thoroughly, hadn't mentioned Sarah Chen or how they'd learned about the recording. Professional, he thought. They'd done this before. Somewhere in a government facility, someone would analyze what he'd captured. Someone already knew what it was. And him? He was just another researcher who'd stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to find. But he still had the transcription. 19 phonetic units. Proof that he hadn't imagined it. Proof that something in the ocean could speak. They came 41 hours after he surfaced. 2 men. Dark sedan. No phone call, no email, no warning. He was at the research station documenting water samples when he saw them walking up the dock. They moved with the kind of certainty that told him they knew exactly where they were going. He knew before they spoke. The taller one showed identification first. Federal credentials. The agency name meant nothing to him at the time. He'd later realize it was a subdivision he couldn't find on any organizational chart. The second man said nothing, just stood with his hands loose at his sides, eyes moving across the station's equipment. "Dr. Hendricks, we need to talk about your dive on the 23rd. Not a question. They already knew. He asked what this was about. The taller one handed him a document, 2 pages, dense legal text, multiple federal statutes cited, Marine Mammal Protection Act, Naval Operation Security Protocols, language about materials that potentially compromise national interests in maritime territories. He read it twice. His hands were shaking by the second read. "We're here for the recording equipment, the hydrophone array, the digital recorder, and any storage devices containing data from your recent dive operations." He tried to explain that this was active research, federally funded research. His grant authorized this work. The shorter man finally spoke. "Your grant authorization doesn't supersede these statutes." They asked him to retrieve the equipment. He walked them to the research lab, the smaller room at the back where he kept the electronics. The shorter man moved immediately to the computer workstation, hands moving across the desk, opening drawers, scanning for drives. The taller one stood beside him, watching him unplug the hydrophone recorder from its charging station. "Backup copies, where are they?" He'd made 3, one on the station's external drive, one on a thumb drive he'd put in his field kit, one uploaded to a cloud storage folder 2 hours before they arrived. He told them about the first 2. The taller man collected the external drive without asking where it was. He walked straight to it, unplugged it, wrapped the cord. The shorter man opened his field kit and removed the thumb drive from the interior pocket. They knew exactly what they were looking for. "Access your cloud storage." He logged in on the workstation. The shorter man didn't ask for the password. He just took the keyboard and navigated the folder structure, located the files, deleted them from the active folder, then emptied the trash. Then he opened the account settings and checked for version history, found the cached versions, deleted those too. The taller man handed him another document. "You need to sign this." Non-disclosure agreement, 2 pages. It specified that he could not discuss the content of the recordings, the circumstances of the dive, or the fact of this confiscation with any party, media, colleagues, family. Violation would result in federal charges under provisions he'd never heard of. There was a phone number at the bottom. If anyone asks about the equipment, you refer them to this number. You don't explain. You don't speculate. He asked what happens if he doesn't sign. "Then we take the equipment anyway under seizure authority, and you spend the next year in legal proceedings that end with the same result, except now there's a federal record with your name flagged." He signed. The shorter man was opening cabinets now. He pulled out the dive logs. 3 months of documented dives, coordinates, times, conditions, observations. He flipped through the most recent one, stopped at the entry for the 23rd, removed that page and the 2 pages after it, folded them, put them in his jacket pocket. Then he kept searching. He found the backup notebook, the one where the researcher had transcribed pieces of the audio from memory after the recording. He took that too. Anything else? Written notes, emails, texts about this dive? He said no. The shorter man looked at him for a long time. If something surfaces later, it becomes a much bigger problem. They packed everything into 2 hard-shell cases they'd brought with them. The recorder, the hydrophone, both drives, the log pages, the notebook. The taller man locked the cases with physical key locks. They walked back up the dock. The researcher followed. He asked when he'd get the equipment back. "You won't." He asked who they work for, really. The taller man stopped at the car. "You're a marine bioacoustics researcher. You've spent years recording whale songs and dolphin clicks. On the night of the 23rd, you were doing exactly that. You recorded marine mammals in a protected sanctuary. That's all you recorded. That's all you remember recording." They drove away. He stood on the dock for 20 minutes, his hands still shaking. His research station suddenly felt smaller. The water looked darker. He walked back inside and sat at the workstation. The folder where the audio files had been was empty. The field kit was open on the table, thumb drive pocket unzipped. The cabinet where he kept the dive logs had been left open. They'd taken everything except the one thing they didn't know about, the transcript he'd memorized. 19 words. He'd repeated them so many times in those 41 hours that they were burned into his memory like coordinates. He hadn't written them down anywhere they could find. He still has them. He heard them 73 times in those 41 hours. Played the recording on repeat. Headphones, full volume, slowing sections down, speeding them up, isolating frequencies. He wasn't trying to analyze. He was trying to memorize the exact sounds, the exact sequence. Because even then, before the men arrived, he knew someone would take it. What he transcribed wasn't words, not in any language he recognized, but they were structured, phonetic, repeated with enough consistency that he could break them into discrete units, syllable-like segments. He wrote them the way they sounded, using English phonetics, because that's all he had. 19 distinct vocalizations, repeated in sequence. The same sequence 3 times during the recording. He wrote them down as A sa, Crito, Ma ren, Sulvino, Thes, Aisa, Drino kes, Mahren, Lasia, Crito, Solvino, Thes a, Ondi, Mahren, Val, Crito, Lasia, Aisa, Thes. He listened to them so many times they stopped sounding alien. They started sounding intentional. The pattern wasn't random. 3 of the sounds, Aesa, Crito, and Mahren, appeared multiple times, 4 times, 3 times, and 3 times respectively. The others appeared once or twice. That distribution wasn't accidental. Repetition in communication usually indicates emphasis or reference. More than that, the sounds came in response to him. He'd been adjusting his position underwater, fin kicks, shifting the hydrophone boom. Right before the first sequence, he'd exhaled, bubbles rising audible on the recording. Then 3.4 seconds later, the first sound, a say. Pause, then the rest followed. Later in the recording, he'd tap the hydrophone housing twice with his glove. Equipment check, standard procedure. The sound was metallic, distinct. 7 seconds after the second tap, the sequence repeated. Same sounds, same order, but faster this time, delivered in 11 seconds instead of the original 14. He'd made sound. It responded. The third repetition came after he'd begun his ascent, the hydrophone still recording as he swam upward. This time, the sequence was slower, elongated. Several of the syllables were stretched, particularly thes and la sia. He couldn't tell if that meant something, prosody maybe, emotion, distance compensation, but it was the tonal quality that stayed with him most. Human vocal tracts produce sound through airflow and vibration, vocal cords, tongue, lips. Marine mammals use different structures. Dolphins generate clicks via phonic lips in their nasal passages. Whales produce low-frequency rumbles through laryngeal structures. Both have distinct acoustic signatures. You can hear the mechanism. These sounds had none of that. No clicks. No vibrato typical of cetacean vocalizations. No growl or rasp from airflow turbulence. The tones were pure, clean, almost synthetic in their clarity. Frequency range was wrong too. Some syllables hit pitches above 18,000 hertz, well into ultrasonic territory, but others dipped below 200 hertz. That's a span most biological vocal systems can't cover. Whatever made these sounds had vocal control beyond anything cataloged. He tried matching the phonetics to known languages. He wasn't a linguist, but he had access to databases. He ran the transcriptions through phonetic comparison algorithms for 43 language families. No matches, not even close. The syllable structures didn't align with any human linguistic pattern. Then he considered the possibility of mimicry. Dolphins mimic. Belugas can approximate human speech patterns. Orcas have been recorded imitating boat engines. Maybe this was sophisticated mimicry, something parroting sounds it had heard, but parrots repeat. They don't construct sequences, they don't respond contextually. These sounds did both. He started thinking of them as words because they functioned like words, discrete units, repeated with consistency, deployed in response to external stimuli. If he assigned them meanings, even arbitrary ones, the sequence started to feel like syntax. Isa opened the sequence and appeared again twice within it. Marker, identifier, I, Maren appeared 3 times, always in the middle section. Subject reference. Thes appeared twice, once near the beginning, once at the end. Affirmative, acknowledgement. He wasn't linguist enough to decode it, but he was scientist enough to know he wasn't hearing random noise. He filled half a notebook in those 41 hours, phonetic transcriptions, frequency analyses, timing charts, spectrogram comparisons. He wrote everything he could remember about the context, depth, temperature, visibility, current, his own actions, the exact timing of the vocalizations. When the men came and took the notebook, they got all of that. But they didn't get the sequence itself. He'd already committed it to memory. 19 sounds, repeated so many times that he hears them when he closes his eyes. Eisa, Krito, Maren. The rhythm is still in his head. He's never spoken them aloud since. The researcher's experience wasn't unprecedented. The legal authority exists. The framework has been used before. The U.S. Navy maintains classification authority over marine acoustic data recorded in federal waters. This isn't controversial. It's codified. Under national security provisions tied to submarine detection and naval operations, maritime recordings can be seized, reviewed, and restricted from public access. The researcher knew this. Every marine bioacoustician working in federal zones knows this. What he didn't expect was how quickly it would be applied to him. The 1997 bloop gives us context. NOAA's Equatorial Pacific Autonomous Hydrophone Array recorded an ultra-low frequency sound, powerful enough to be detected across multiple sensors more than 5,000 kilometers apart. The recording was made public. The speculation began immediately. Something massive and biological, larger than any known animal. Then the Navy became involved. The official assessment eventually classified it as icequake activity. Full analysis files remain partially classified more than 2 decades later. The pattern is consistent. Record something anomalous in federal waters, attract attention from entities with classification authority, watch your data disappear into bureaucratic structures you can't access. The researcher wasn't operating in a designated naval zone. His research station sat within a protected marine sanctuary, miles from any restricted area. The men who arrived cited authority under provisions he'd never encountered in 15 years of fieldwork. They didn't threaten. They didn't need to. The credentials were legitimate. The paperwork was thorough. Everything was removed within 40 minutes. No AA and the Naval Oceanographic Office share jurisdiction over certain categories of marine data. If a recording is deemed relevant to national security, submarine signatures, classified sonar installations, or anything that might compromise naval operations, it becomes restricted material. The threshold for relevance is determined internally. There's no appeal process, no hearing. The decision is final before the researcher even knows the review happened. He asked what made his recording relevant to national security. They told him the classification review was ongoing. He asked when he could expect his equipment returned. They told him he'd be contacted. He asked if he was prohibited from discussing what he'd recorded. That's when they mentioned the NDA. The document he signed wasn't optional. Refusal would constitute obstruction of a federal investigation. The terms were broad: no disclosure of the recording's content, no discussion of the confiscation process, no contact with media regarding the incident. Violation carried criminal penalties. He read it twice. He signed. Legal scholars have questioned the enforceability of NDAs signed under these conditions. Coercion arguments, lack of independent counsel, absence of compensation for seized property. But challenges are expensive. They take years. And they require the signer to violate the NDA in order to contest it, exposing themselves to prosecution before any judicial review. Most researchers stay silent. The framework exists because legitimate security concerns exist. Submarine detection relies on cataloging ocean sounds, biological, geological, man-made. An adversary analyzing publicly available marine recordings could theoretically extract acoustic signatures of U.S. naval assets. The classification system exists to prevent that. It's rational, it's necessary, but it also provides cover for removing evidence of anything else. The researcher will never know if his recording was classified because it captured something security relevant or because it captured something someone decided the public shouldn't hear. The distinction matters. The outcome is identical. 3 weeks after the confiscation, his federal research permits were suspended pending review. No explanation. The review took 8 months. When the permits were finally reinstated, they came with geographic restrictions. He was prohibited from conducting research in the zone where he'd made the recording. His grant funding expired 4 months later. The renewal application, identical to proposals that had been approved for 6 consecutive years, was rejected. The rejection letter cited budget constraints and shifting research priorities. He applied to 3 other federal funding programs. All 3 rejected him within the same week. Professional isolation followed. A colleague he'd worked with for a decade stopped returning calls. Another canceled a scheduled collaboration, citing vague institutional concerns. An invitation to present at a marine biology conference was quietly rescinded. No one said why. No one needed to. He wasn't blacklisted in any formal sense. His credentials remained valid. His published research was still cited. But opportunities dried up in ways that felt systematic. Grant reviews that should have been straightforward resulted in rejections. Permit applications took months longer than normal, then came back with unusual restrictions. Invitations to collaborative projects stopped arriving. He began to suspect his communications were monitored. Emails to colleagues about unrelated research would be followed within days by pointed questions from agency administrators about his current projects. A phone conversation with a journalist, not about the incident, about coastal erosion patterns, preceded the sudden appearance of an audit notice for his research expenditures. The audit found no irregularities, but it consumed 4 months and thousands of dollars in legal fees. He couldn't prove surveillance. He couldn't prove coordination between agencies. But the timing felt deliberate. Other researchers who've publicized controversial findings describe similar patterns: funding withdrawal, institutional pressure, professional isolation. Not threats, something subtler. A series of bureaucratic obstacles and closed doors that eventually make continued work impossible. He considered going public despite the NDA calculated the risk. Criminal prosecution was possible, though perhaps unlikely. Making a martyr of him would draw more attention than quietly managing his professional decline. But legal fees alone could bankrupt him, and who would believe him without the recording? Without evidence, he'd be another researcher with an incredible story and nothing to back it up. He tried returning to fieldwork in unrestricted zones, applied for private funding outside federal channels, secured a small grant from a marine conservation nonprofit for acoustic monitoring of whale populations. The work was legitimate, routine. He recorded hundreds of hours of humpback vocalizations, dolphin echolocation, the usual catalog of biological ocean sounds. He never conducted another night dive. The decision wasn't conscious at first. He scheduled daytime dives, told himself it was about optimal recording conditions, about surface light for equipment checks. But months passed, then years, and he never once submerged after dark. The real reason, the one he wouldn't articulate even to himself, the possibility of hearing it again. Not the possibility that it wasn't there, the possibility that it was. 5 years after the confiscation, he received a visit from a man who identified himself as a private maritime consultant. The man knew details about the incident that had never been disclosed. He suggested the researcher consider international work. Australia had opportunities, New Zealand, Canada, places outside U.S. jurisdiction. The man never said why the researcher should leave, never implied a threat. Just offered the suggestion, left a business card, and departed. The researcher still has the card. He's never called the number. He works now in marine environmental consulting, acoustic surveys for offshore wind farm installations. The pay is adequate. The work is legitimate, if uninspiring. He hasn't published original research in 4 years. Most of his colleagues from that earlier life have stopped contacting him. Some probably think he burned out. Others might suspect the truth, but know better than to ask. He still has the transcript. 19 words, phonetically rendered, memorized, and written down before the men arrived. He keeps it in a safety deposit box at a bank 2 towns away from where he lives. He's made arrangements for it to be released to specific journalists if he dies unexpectedly. He doesn't expect to die unexpectedly, but the precaution feels necessary. At night, sometimes he thinks about what's still down there in that sanctuary zone, in the dark water where he can no longer legally work. Whether it's still there, whether others have heard it, whether their recordings were also confiscated, their careers also quietly dismantled, their silence also purchased through systematic professional destruction. He wonders how many others are out there carrying transcripts in safety deposit boxes, waiting for a moment that will probably never come to speak. The idea sounds absurd until you consider how little we actually know. The researcher heard something that day, something structured, something responsive, something that no cataloged marine species produces. And within 48 hours, federal agents arrived to erase every trace of it. That response tells you something. If he'd captured whale song, they wouldn't have come. If he'd recorded unusual seal vocalizations, he would have published a paper. If the audio contained classified submarine frequencies, they would have confiscated the equipment and said exactly that. They didn't say anything. They took everything and left him with a non-disclosure agreement and the clear understanding that his career depended on forgetting what he'd heard. Which raises the question, what would justify that response? One possibility keeps surfacing, not because it's comfortable, but because it fits the pattern. Something intelligent lives in the deep ocean, something vocal, something that's been encountered before. The ocean covers 71% of Earth's surface. We've mapped roughly 20% of the seafloor in any detail. The remaining 80% remains less explored than the surface of Mars. Vast trench systems, underwater cave networks, and abyssal territories exist in near total darkness, visited by humans perhaps once, perhaps never. If an intelligent vocal species exists in those regions, limited human presence means encounters would be rare, but not impossible. Historical accounts describe mermaid songs with striking consistency. Ancient Mediterranean texts reference underwater voices near specific coastal regions. Caribbean fishermen still report hearing woman-like singing during night operations in certain waters. These reports cluster geographically. The same regions produce the same descriptions across decades, across cultures, across witnesses, with no connection to each other. That clustering matters. Random hallucination doesn't produce geographic consistency. Mass hysteria doesn't maintain stable boundaries across centuries. But a biological entity with a territorial range would generate exactly that pattern. The researcher's location wasn't random. He was working in a marine sanctuary with complex underwater topography, deep channels, cave systems, territories where sunlight never reaches. The kind of environment where something could exist largely undetected. His hydrophone captured structured vocalization, call and response patterns, phonetic sequences that repeated with variation, suggesting intentional communication rather than random biological noise. He's a trained bioacoustic researcher. He knows dolphin mimicry, whale song dialects, seal vocalizations, fish chorusing. What he recorded didn't match any of them. It matched the old descriptions. And someone wanted it gone. There's precedent for this. In the early 2000s, Japanese researchers working near Antarctica reported large humanoid figures underwater. They called them ningen. Photographic evidence was claimed. Official dismissal followed immediately. The story persists, but the researchers themselves went silent. Multiple commercial submarine cable engineers have reported anomalous sounds near deep infrastructure. Equipment damage without explanation, sounds that don't correspond to known geological or biological sources. Retired naval personnel hint at unusual acoustic contacts during deep-water operations. They don't elaborate. They mention it once and change the subject. Deep-sea mining operations in certain regions have experienced consistent equipment failures, strange sounds on their arrays. They file reports internally. Nothing reaches public record. The pattern isn't proof, but it's a pattern. Governments have strong reasons to suppress evidence of intelligent, non-human entities in territorial waters. Sovereignty claims over ocean regions assume empty territory. Discovery of intelligent inhabitants creates legal complications no existing framework addresses. Who holds rights to those waters? What protocols govern interaction? What happens when a naval vessel encounters something that responds intelligently but isn't human? Those questions don't have answers, so the evidence doesn't surface. The researcher's recording would have raised all of them. Structured vocalization from an unknown source in protected waters means something is there, something that communicates, something that might be aware of us. The fastest way to avoid those questions is to erase the evidence, which they did. But he remembers what he heard. He transcribed 19 words from memory before they arrived, phonetic approximations of sounds that repeated, varied, responded, sounds that suggested language. He won't share the transcript, not publicly. He signed an NDA that he believes is enforceable, and he believes his communications are monitored. But he's confirmed this much: what he heard sounded structured, intentional, and impossible. And it came from something alive. The ocean remains vast and largely unknown. Hydrothermal vent ecosystems were discovered in 1977, entire biological communities living in conditions previously thought uninhabitable. Giant squid, suspected but unconfirmed for centuries, weren't filmed alive until 2012. New species are cataloged constantly. We don't know what's down there. The researchers' experience suggests that someone does, that certain entities have been encountered before, that protocols exist for managing evidence when it surfaces, and that the official position remains: nothing's there. He hasn't returned to night diving. He doesn't work in marine sanctuaries anymore. His federal research permits were never renewed. Grant funding disappeared. Colleagues stopped responding. He keeps the 19 words in his memory and doesn't speak them aloud. Because if something intelligent is singing in the deep ocean and governments are actively suppressing proof of it, then the question isn't whether it exists. The question is what else they know. 80% of the ocean remains unmapped. That number gets repeated often enough that it loses meaning. So consider what it actually represents. Vast territories of this planet remain fundamentally unknown to us. Trench systems deeper than Everest is. Tall, underwater cave networks that extend for miles. Abyssal plains covering areas larger than continents. We've sent more people into space than into the deepest ocean regions, and we've barely listened. The researcher was listening that night. Professional-grade hydrophone equipment, optimal conditions, documented methodology. He captured something that shouldn't exist according to current biological records. Then it was erased. But the pattern extends beyond one incident. Marine biologists working in specific regions have reported pressure to recant unusual findings. Not incorrect findings, unusual ones. Observations that don't fit established categories. Several have described phone calls from officials they couldn't identify, suggesting their data contained errors that needed correction. The corrections always moved findings toward the conventional. Commercial operations in deep water report anomalies they don't publicize. Submarine cable engineers mention sounds near infrastructure that don't match known sources. Deep-sea mining equipment fails in patterns that suggest interaction rather than malfunction. Sonar arrays detect large biological targets that disappear before identification. These reports stay internal. Naval personnel who've served on submarines occasionally reference unusual acoustic contacts during deep-water operations. They don't elaborate in detail. They mention it briefly, then redirect conversation. The consistency of their reticence suggests briefings, protocols, established procedures for what can and cannot be discussed. Something has been encountered before. The researcher's recording wasn't the first evidence. It was simply evidence that reached someone without proper clearance, himself. He was supposed to be capturing baseline bioacoustic data. Instead, he captured something that triggered a response mechanism. Federal agents don't confiscate marine research data over dolphin calls. They came because he'd recorded something protected by classification protocols, something with established procedures for containment, something that's been managed before, which means institutional knowledge exists. Someone, somewhere, has access to more recordings like his, more incidents, more encounters, more evidence that didn't reach public record. Enough evidence to justify suppression protocols. Enough evidence to maintain active monitoring of researchers working in sensitive regions. You don't build an infrastructure around nothing. The question becomes, what exactly are they managing? The most uncomfortable possibility remains the most consistent with available evidence. Intelligent vocal entities exist in deep ocean environments. They've been encountered sporadically throughout history. Modern acoustic technology has captured evidence multiple times, and governments have decided that disclosure serves no strategic purpose. The alternative, that all of this is coincidence, misidentification, and bureaucratic overreach, requires believing that federal agents routinely confiscate legitimate marine research for no reason. That historical accounts of underwater singing across multiple cultures stem from shared delusion. That geographic clustering of similar reports means nothing. That the researcher imagined structured, responsive vocalization from an unknown source, and federal officials imagined it was worth erasing. Occam's razor cuts the other direction. Something is there, it communicates, it's been documented, and the documentation is classified. The ocean provides perfect concealment. Intelligent entities operating in deep water, in trench systems, in underwater caves would encounter humans rarely. Our presence in those environments remains minimal. Submersible expeditions visit specific sites briefly. Naval operations follow established routes. Commercial activity concentrates in accessible regions. Vast territories remain untouched. If you wanted to remain hidden from human detection, the deep ocean offers the only environment on Earth where that's still possible. And if evidence of your existence surfaces occasionally, a recording, a sighting, an encounter, suppression remains straightforward. The witness is isolated, the evidence is confiscated, the official record stays silent. Most witnesses don't fight it. The researcher didn't fight it. He signed the NDA. He accepted the end of his research career. He keeps the 19 words in his memory and doesn't dive at night anymore. Because he understands what he heard, something responsive, something structured, something that shouldn't exist but does. And somewhere in a classified facility, his recording sits in a file with others like it. Evidence that never reaches public analysis, proof that remains officially denied. The ocean keeps its secrets well, but not perfectly. Cracks appear. Researchers capture audio they shouldn't. Witnesses report encounters that don't fit approved categories. Patterns emerge for anyone willing to look at the data without dismissing it reflexively. The pattern says we're not alone in the ocean. The pattern says something intelligent shares this planet with us, living in regions we've barely explored. The pattern says governments know this, have known this, and have decided that we don't need to. Maybe they're right. Maybe disclosure would create panic, destabilize systems, raise questions no one knows how to answer. Maybe the infrastructure of suppression exists to protect us from information we can't productively use. Or maybe it exists to protect something else. The researcher surfaces from his night dive, listens to his recording, and hears 19 words that change everything. Within 48 hours, men arrive and take it all. He's left with memory and silence, but memory persists, and the ocean is still singing.